You woke up this morning and performed a miracle, though you didn't realize it. You stepped into a small tiled room, turned a chrome lever, and instantly summoned a torrent of heated, pressurized, chemically purified water. You reached for a bar of soap, a sophisticated surfactant engineered to bridge the gap between water and oil, and you scrubbed away the microscopic debris of your sleep. For you, this was a moment of mindless routine. It cost you nothing but 5 minutes of your time. You believe, with the absolute certainty of a modern citizen, that being clean is your natural state. You believe that dirt is a choice and that hygiene is the fundamental baseline of a civilized life. But if you could take that hot shower, that bar of scented soap, and that belief in the sanitary baseline and transport yourself back 500 years, you wouldn't be seen as a paragon of health. To the most learned men of the 15th century, the doctors of the Sorbonne, the royal physicians, the wisest bishops, you would look like a person committing a slow, damp act of suicide. For more than 1,000 years, the greatest minds in the Western world agreed on a single, terrifying premise. Water is a predator. They believed that your skin was not a barrier, but a porous, fragile membrane, a sieve. They were convinced that every time you submerged yourself in a bath, especially a hot one, you were performing a dangerous medical procedure. You were softening your flesh, opening your pores like tiny floodgates, and inviting the invisible demons of disease, the poisonous miasmas of the air, and death itself to walk right into your bloodstream. To understand how we became a species that spent centuries fearing its own sweat, we have to look at the world we lost. We have to go back to a time when humanity was wetter, steamier, and more obsessed with the surface of the body than we are today. We have to go back to Rome. If you were to stand in the center of Rome in the 2nd century AD, at the height of the Pax Romana, the sound that would define the city wouldn't be the clattering of chariots or the shouting of the Forum. It would be the sound of rushing water. Rome was a civilization fueled by an almost religious obsession with the bath. To a Roman, the distinction between a citizen and a barbarian wasn't just about language or law, it was about the scent of the skin. Barbarians lived in the dry, dusty forests of the north. They were unwashed, crusty, and animalistic. A Roman, by contrast, was damp, oiled, and scraped clean. The great baths, or thermae, were the architectural cathedrals of the Roman genius. These weren't just bathrooms, they were massive, marble-clad palaces of social engineering. Imagine the baths of Caracalla. They covered 62 acres. They were decorated with towering statues like the Farnese Bull, intricate mosaics that shimmered under the skylights, and soaring, vaulted ceilings that seemed to defy gravity. Thousands of people, up to 1,600 at a single time, would gather here every day. The ritual of the bath was a masterpiece of thermal progression. You didn't just hop in a tub, you entered the apoditerium, the changing room, where you stripped naked. This was the ultimate social equalizer. In the steam of the bath, the senator stood shoulder to shoulder with the shoemaker. The billionaire landlord was indistinguishable from the freed slave. From there, you moved to the palestra to exercise, wrestling or playing ball to work up a thick, healthy sweat. But the Romans didn't have soap, not the way you know it. They viewed the soap used by the Germanic tribes as a crude, harsh substance meant for bleaching hair, not cleaning skin. Instead, they used the oil and iron method. A slave would coat your body in the finest olive oil, often scented with expensive resins from the east. Then you would move into the calidarium, the hot room. This room was a miracle of ancient engineering. Beneath the floor sat a hypocaust, a massive, roaring furnace tended by a literal army of underground slaves. This furnace pumps searing hot air through hollow brick spaces in the walls and beneath the marble floors. It was so hot that you had to wear special wooden-soled sandals just to keep your feet from blistering as you walked. The air was thick with a heavy, wet steam. As you sat there, the oil on your skin would mingle with your sweat, lifting the dust of the city out of your pores. Then came the strigil. This was a curved metal tool, usually made of bronze or iron. A slave would take this blade and systematically scrape your body, from your shoulders to your ankles. With each stroke, a gray, viscous sludge of oil, dead skin, and sweat would be peeled away and flicked onto the floor. To a Roman, this was the moment of true cleanliness, the physical removal of the old self. You finish the process with a plunge into the frigidarium, a pool of bracingly cold water designed to shock the system and snap your pores shut, sealing your body against the outside world. The Romans brought this wet lifestyle to every corner of their empire. They built massive stone aqueducts, gravity-fed engineering marvels that marched across the landscape for miles, just to ensure that even a tiny outpost in the freezing hills of northern England or the edge of the Saharan desert had enough water to feed a communal bath. For 500 years, Western humanity lived in a state of constant public immersion. And then the water stopped. As the Roman Empire buckled under the weight of civil war, economic collapse, and the relentless pressure of invading tribes, the first thing to break was the infrastructure of the bath. The aqueducts were cut by Goths and Vandals to starve the cities. The massive lead pipes were melted down for weapons. The underground furnaces of the hypocausts went cold, and the marble was stripped from the walls to build fortresses. But the physical destruction of the baths was only half the story. The real great forgetting was psychological. A new power was rising in the ruins of the classical world, the early Christian church. And the church looked at the Roman baths, those places of public nudity, casual sex, plotting, and pagan indulgence, and they saw a temple of the flesh. They saw a distraction from the soul. The early Desert Fathers and the saints of the new era began to preach a radical new doctrine, holy squalor. Saint Jerome, one of the most powerful voices in early Christianity, argued that once a person had been washed in the blood of Christ through baptism, they never needed to wash their physical body again. He praised those who lived in a state of permanent filth as being more spiritually advanced. To tend to the skin was a sin of pride. To smell like the earth was a sign of humility. St. Paula, a wealthy Roman widow who turned to the church, was praised for her refusal to bathe, claiming that the purity of the body is the impurity of the soul. Nuns were forbidden from taking baths because seeing one's own naked body was considered an act of lust. Monks competed to see who could go the most decades without water touching their limbs. Hygiene was no longer a sign of civilization, it was a sign of pagan decadence. In the span of a few generations, the technical knowledge of how to move and heat water vanished from the European mind. The world became dry, dusty, and silent. For a few centuries in the Middle Ages, some vestige of bathing returned in the form of stews, communal bathhouses that were popular in cities like London and Paris. But these weren't Roman palaces. They were small, wooden, often seedy establishments where people ate, drank, and socialized in hot tubs. They were a compromise between the old world and the new. But in 1347, the compromise ended in blood and terror. That was the year the Black Death arrived in Europe. It was an apocalypse. In the span of just 4 years, it wiped out nearly half the population of the continent. Death was everywhere. It was in the streets, in the churches, in the air. The doctors of the time, working without the benefit of microscopes or germ theory, were desperate to find a cause. They looked to the heavens, to the alignment of the planets, and most importantly, they looked to the miasma theory. They believed that disease was caused by malaria, bad air. They thought the plague was a poisonous cloud of corruption that hovered over the earth. The Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris, the highest medical authority in the world, was ordered by the king to investigate. Their verdict changed human behavior for nearly half a millennium. They argued that the greatest danger a human being could face was the opening of the pores. And what opened the pores more than anything else? Hot water. The logic was as simple as it was terrifying. When you sit in a hot bath, your skin softens and expands. Your pores, those millions of tiny holes, stretch open. In that moment, you are defenseless. The poisonous air of the plague can slip right through your skin and settle in your organs. Therefore, the safest thing you could do to survive the Black Death was to stay as dirty as possible. They believed that a crust of natural oils, sweat, and dirt acted as a biological armor. It plugged the pores, it sealed the body. If you were thick with grime, the plague had no doorway. Cleanliness wasn't a virtue, it was an invitation to the grave. The stews were slammed shut. Public bathing was banned in cities across Europe, not because of religious morality, but because of a genuine, state-sponsored medical terror. People began to look at a basin of water with the same fear we might look at a radioactive waste container. The communal, wet life of humanity died in the 14th century, replaced by a deep, shivering fear of the tub. We entered the age of the crust. For the next 400 years, Western civilization would engage in a massive continental experiment. How do you live a complete human life, from birth to death, without ever submerging your body in water? How do you manage the staggering physical consequences of a body that is never washed? How do you hide the smell of rot? How do you handle the parasites that live in your hair and your clothes? The answers they found were as disgusting as they were ingenious. They involved a new obsession with white linen, the birth of the global perfume industry, and a bizarre medical ritual called the dry rub. This is the world of your ancestors, a world where the stench of a crowd was so powerful it could make a modern person faint. A world where soap was something you used to clean your laundry, but never your skin. And it all rested on one fundamental, paralyzing belief, that the water in your basin wasn't there to clean you, it was there to kill you. Imagine walking through the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles in the year 1680. To your modern eyes, it is the pinnacle of human achievement. Gold leaf drips from the ceilings, massive windows flood the gallery with light. The finest silk and velvet in the world drape the bodies of the aristocracy. This is the grand siècle, the height of French elegance. But as you walk through this golden corridor, your modern senses would be under a brutal, physical assault. The air in Versailles was not the fresh, floral scent of a garden. It was a thick, viscous soup of human decay. It was the smell of 500 courtiers who had never taken a bath, their sweat fermenting under layers of heavy wool and silk, their breath rotting from untreated tooth decay, their bodies coated in a mixture of old perfume and rancid grease. In this era, the most beautiful palace on earth was also the most pungent. And yet, if you were to tell the Sun King, Louis XIV, that he was dirty, he would be genuinely offended. Because in the 17th century, the definition of clean had absolutely nothing to do with skin. To understand this, you have to understand the linen revolution. By the mid-1600s, the medical terror of water that had begun with the Black Death had hardened into an absolute cultural law. The bathtub was seen as a grave. Hot water was still viewed as a dangerous solvent that melted the body's defenses. But humans still sweat. They still smelled. They still felt the grittiness of a body left unwashed. To solve this, Western civilization turned to a different material to do the work of water: white linen. Linen is made from the fibers of the flax plant. It is a remarkable fabric, porous, breathable, and highly absorbent. In the 17th century, linen was believed to have supernatural cleaning properties. Doctors argued that linen acted as a mechanical sponge for the skin. It didn't just sit on the body, it inhaled the sweat and oils. It wicked away the impurities of the flesh. Therefore, you didn't need to wash your skin with water. You just needed to wrap your skin in white linen and let the fabric do the washing for you. This created a completely new social hierarchy. In our world, a clean person is someone who showers every day. In the world of the Sun King, a clean person was someone who changed their linen shirt multiple times a day. Hygiene was no longer a private act in a bathroom, it was a public performance of laundry. If you were a wealthy aristocrat, your day didn't start with a shower. It started with the levee, the ritual of the rising. You would stand in front of a crowd of witnesses while servants used a dry cloth to rub your hands and face. This was the dry rub. Then they would pull a fresh, starch-white linen shirt over your head. The whiter and crispier the linen, the cleaner you were perceived to be. Look at the portraits from this era. Why do you think the men wear those massive, elaborate white lace collars and ruffled cuffs? Those weren't just fashion choices, they were status signals of hygiene. The lace showed that you had the money to own dozens of expensive shirts and the staff to have them bleached, starched, and pressed. A man could have a body covered in sores and filth, but if his lace collar was snowy white, he was considered a paragon of cleanliness. White linen was the invisible bath. This obsession reached its peak with Louis XIV. There is a persistent historical legend that the Sun King only bathed twice in his entire life, and that both times made him so ill that he vowed never to do it again. While historians debate the exact number, the reality was that Louis was a dry hygiene extremist. His morning routine was a state event. His physicians would rub his skin with spirits of wine, alcohol, to disinfect him, and he would change his linen shirt 3 to 5 times a day. But even with 5 shirt changes a day, the biology of 500 people living in a palace without plumbing was inescapable. Versailles had no toilets. Courtiers would often relieve themselves behind curtains, in stairwells, or into silver bowls called pots de chambre, which were then dumped out of windows or into the gardens. The palace was a nightmare of filth. To combat the overwhelming stench of humanity and waste, the 17th century gave birth to the second great pillar of dry hygiene, the perfume industry. This wasn't perfume as we know it today, a light, pleasant accent. This was olfactory warfare. The goal of perfume in the age of Louis XIV was to create a scent barrier that could overwhelm the smell of rot. The scents of the time were heavy, animalistic, and incredibly powerful. The favorites were musk from the glands of a deer, ambergris from the digestive system of whales, and most shockingly, civet, a substance secreted by the anal glands of the civet cat. These were thick, dirty smells that lasted for days. Louis XIV was so obsessed with scent that he became known as the sweetest-smelling king in the world. He demanded that every room in Versailles be sprayed with a different fragrance. He had his shirts, his gloves, and even the palace fountains infused with perfume. But there was a dark irony to this. By the end of his life, the king had developed such a severe sensitivity to these heavy scents that he could no longer stand them. The only smell he could tolerate was the light scent of orange blossoms. Legend says that courtiers who wanted to win his favor had to stop using perfume entirely, leading to a period where the king was surrounded by a natural human stench that even he found difficult to bear. And then there was the problem of the hair. In a world without water, hair becomes a disaster. It traps grease, it mats, and most importantly, it becomes a breeding ground for lice. The solution wasn't to wash the hair, it was to hide it. This was the era of the peruke, the great wig. These massive, towering constructions of horsehair or human hair were coated in pomade, a sticky mixture of animal fat, and then dusted with clouds of scented flour or powder. Underneath these magnificent wigs, the real hair of the aristocrats was often shaved or cropped short to manage the lice. But the lice simply moved into the wigs. To deal with the itching, people carried scratching sticks, long silver rods with a small hand on the end, to reach under their wigs and scrape at their scalps. They even used lice traps, small hollow pendants containing a piece of cloth soaked in blood and honey, worn around the neck to lure the insects away from the skin. Everything about 17th century hygiene was about the surface. If the surface, the wig, the lace, the makeup, was perfect, the reality of the body underneath didn't matter. Women would coat their faces in ceruse, a thick white makeup made of lead. It gave them a ghostly, translucent look that was highly prized. But lead is a poison. It rotted the skin, caused their hair to fall out, and eventually seeped into their organs, leading to a slow, agonizing death. To hide the pits and scars caused by the lead makeup, they would apply patches, small pieces of black silk in the shape of hearts or moons. Think about the physical reality of a high-ranking woman in Versailles. She is wearing a wig that hasn't been cleaned in months. Her skin is coated in toxic lead. Her body is wrapped in layers of silk and lace that have absorbed weeks of sweat. And she is doused in the anal secretions of a cat to hide the smell of her own unwashed flesh. And she is considered the most beautiful, most civilized person in Europe. This was the grand illusion of hygiene. It was a culture that had completely divorced the concept of clean from the concept of water. But the dry era couldn't last forever. Even as Louis XIV was changing his fifth shirt of the day, the first cracks were appearing in the medical theory that water was a killer. In the late 17th century, a new invention began to change how we saw the world: the microscope. In the 1670s, a Dutch scientist named Antony van Leeuwenhoek began looking at drops of water and scrapings from his own teeth through his homemade lenses. He was the first human being to see what he called animalcules, the tiny swimming organisms we now know as bacteria. He was horrified. He saw that the clean surfaces of his world were actually crawling with invisible life. At the same time, a new generation of doctors, the neo-Hippocratics, started to question the fear of the bath. They began to notice that the crust of grime they had encouraged for centuries wasn't a shield, it was a source of irritation and disease. They started to wonder if the Romans, with their marble palaces and rushing water, might have been onto something after all. But the shift back to water wouldn't be easy. It would take an intellectual revolution, a change in how we defined privacy, and a massive industrial breakthrough to convince humanity to step back into the tub. It would take the Enlightenment to teach us that the smell of a human being wasn't a natural vapor, but a sign of a body in crisis. The world of Louis XIV was a world where clean was a costume. It was a world that spent a fortune on laundry and perfume to avoid a basin of water. It was the peak of human vanity, and it was a fragile, stinking bubble that was about to burst. For the next 100 years, the battle for the human body would be fought between the dry and the wet, between those who believed in the power of the linen shirt and those who were starting to rediscover the ancient bracing power of the cold plunge. And as the 18th century dawned, the Sun King's stench would become the symbol of everything that was wrong with the old world, a world that was about to be washed away. If you were to step out of the stinking, perfume-choked corridors of Versailles and into the London of the mid-1700s, you would notice a subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere. The world was still dirty. The streets were still open sewers. The Thames was a slow-moving sludge of industrial waste and human excrement. But in the salons of the Enlightenment, the smell of power was changing. The heavy, animalistic musk of the 17th century was falling out of fashion. A new ideal was emerging, not the smell of a civet cat, but the smell of nothing. This was the century of reason. For the first time in history, philosophers and scientists began to look at the human body not as a sinful vessel or a porous sieve for plague, but as a biological machine. And like any machine, it needed to be maintained. This was the era when humanity began to rediscover water, not as a social ritual and certainly not as a daily habit, but as a medicine. The return of the bath began with a shiver. By the 1750s, a new generation of physicians began to challenge the miasma theory that had kept people dry for 400 years. They started to look at the skin differently. They realized that the crust of grime they had once praised as armor was actually suffocating the body. They developed a new theory, that the skin was an organ of respiration and excretion. If the pores remained blocked by grease and old powder, the vital spirits couldn't circulate, leading to what they called the vapors, melancholy, or shattered nerves. But they didn't suggest a warm, relaxing soak. That was still considered feminine and enervating. Instead, they promoted the cold plunge. Bathing returned to the West as a form of shock therapy. Doctors argued that plunging into ice-cold water, especially seawater, would brace the nerves, strengthen the muscles, and cure everything from infertility to madness. This was the birth of the spa culture. Towns like Bath in England and Baden-Baden in Germany were transformed from sleepy villages into sprawling, neoclassical playgrounds for the wealthy. But if you were a patient at an 18th century spa, your bath wasn't a luxury. It was a grueling ordeal. Picture a wealthy woman being led into the freezing waves of the North Sea by a dipper, a massive, muscular woman whose job was to forcibly submerge the patient in the water while they screamed. This was medical bathing. It was loud, it was painful, and it was deeply uncomfortable. But it was the bridge. Water was no longer the enemy. It was a tool. While the doctors were medicalizing water, the architects were rediscovering Rome. In 1748, the ruins of Pompeii were rediscovered, frozen in time by the ash of Vesuvius. As excavations began, the Enlightenment world was shocked by what they saw. They found houses with dedicated bathrooms. They found lead pipes that still functioned. They found the remains of the great Roman spas. This classical revival made the bath seem not just healthy, but noble. The aristocracy began to install cold baths in their country estates, small, stone-lined basins in the basement where a gentleman could prove his stoicism by dunking himself in 50-degree water every morning. But the real revolution in hygiene didn't come from a doctor or an architect. It came from a man who had no title, no great wealth, and no medical degree. His name was George Bryan Brummel, better known to history as Beau Brummel. Beau Brummel was the world's first influencer. In the early 1800s, he reigned over London society as the absolute arbiter of taste. Before Brummel, the English gentleman looked like a smaller version of Louis XIV. He wore a powdered wig, silk stockings, high heels, and heavy perfume. He smelled of musk and sweat. Brummel looked at this and saw something vulgar. Brummel invented the dandy. He threw away the wig and cut his hair into a short Roman style. He replaced the colorful silks with a somber, perfectly tailored navy blue coat and long trousers, the ancestor of the modern suit. But his most radical innovation was invisible. Beau Brummel claimed that he spent 5 hours every morning getting dressed, and the foundation of that process was a daily wash. Brummel insisted on scrubbing his entire body with a stiff brush and cold water until his skin was red. He famously declared that a gentleman should never smell of perfume. He argued that the only acceptable scent for a man was the smell of fresh air and clean linen. This was the Brummel shift. He took the dry hygiene of the linen shirt and combined it with the wet hygiene of the bath. He turned cleanliness into a moral virtue. To be clean was to be disciplined. To be dirty was to be loose, immoral, and lower class. For the first time since Rome, the smell of a human being became a marker of their character. But Brummel's revolution had a gatekeeper: soap. For thousands of years, soap had been a brutal industrial substance. It was made by boiling animal fat, tallow, with wood ash, lye. It was harsh, it smelled like a dead farm, and it was so alkaline it could literally peel the skin off your face. Most people used it only for laundry or for cleaning the floors. But as the Brummelian ideal of cleanliness spread, the demand for toilet soap, soap meant for the body, exploded. The breakthrough came in 1789, the same year as the French Revolution. A man named Andrew Pears, a barber in London's Soho, realized that if he wanted the wealthy to use soap, he had to make it delicate. He began to refine the soap-making process, removing the impurities and adding glycerin and the scent of English gardens, roses, lavender, and cedar. He created Pears Transparent Soap. This was the first luxury soap. It was clear, it was gentle, and it was expensive. It transformed the act of washing from a medical necessity into an aesthetic pleasure. Suddenly, soap and water wasn't just for the sick or the stoic, it was for the respectable. But here is the dark side of the Enlightenment's discovery of water. As cleanliness became a virtue, it also became a weapon of social exclusion. In the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was gathering steam. Millions of people were pouring into cities like London, Manchester, and New York, living in overcrowded tenements without access to water or air. These were the great unwashed. To the middle and upper classes, the smell of the poor wasn't just unpleasant, it was a moral failure. The elite had their Andrew Pears soap, their cold plunge basins, and their dozens of linen shirts. The poor had nothing. In 1830, a working-class family in London might have to share a single outdoor water pump with 300 other people. That water was often contaminated with cholera and typhus. If you wanted to bathe, you had to carry every gallon of water up the stairs, heat it on a coal stove, which cost money you didn't have, and sit in a cramped tin tub. Cleanliness was becoming a class divider. The wealthier you were, the higher you lived, as we saw in the video on elevators, and the cleaner you were perceived to be. The poor were trapped in a smell ghetto. Their lack of hygiene was used as a justification for their lack of rights. Politicians and, quote, social reformers argued that there was no point in giving the poor the vote or better wages because they were, quote, naturally filthy and bestial. The medical world was also evolving. In 1848, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis made a discovery that should have saved millions of lives. He was working in a maternity ward in Vienna and noticed a terrifying trend. Women were dying of childbed fever at a much higher rate in the ward where doctors and medical students worked than in the ward where midwives worked. Semmelweis realized the medical students were performing autopsies on dead bodies and then walking straight into the maternity ward to examine pregnant women without washing their hands. He didn't know about germs. That word didn't exist yet, but he knew there were cadaverous particles on their fingers. He ordered his students to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime. The death rate plummeted from 18% to less than 2%. But the medical establishment didn't celebrate them. They were insulted. These were gentlemen, and a gentleman's hands were clean by definition. The idea that a doctor could be carrying death on his fingers was an outrage. Semmelweis was mocked, his theory was rejected, and he eventually died in a mental asylum, beaten to death by guards, just a few years before his theory was proven correct. The world was on the brink of the greatest medical breakthrough in history. The stage was set for Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. The age of the crust was finally over, but the age of the germ was about to begin. And as the 19th century moved toward its end, the bar of soap would move from the barber shop to the laboratory. Cleanliness was about to stop being about reason or fashion or stoicism. It was about to become a matter of life or death. The necessity to be clean was no longer a suggestion from Beau Brummel. It was a command from the microscopic world. Humanity was finally stepping into the tub, but they weren't alone. They were bringing their fear of the invisible with them. And that fear would create an industry that would eventually convince us that our own bodies were a biohazard that needed to be sterilized every single day. If you could travel back to London in the summer of 1858, you wouldn't need a map to find the city. You would find it with your nose from 10 miles away. This was the year of the Great Stink, a moment when the thousands of years of human filth we've been tracking finally reached a breaking point. For centuries, Londoners had been dumping their waste into cesspools beneath their floorboards or directly into the River Thames. By 1858, the Thames was no longer a river. It was a slow-moving, fermented sludge of human excrement, industrial chemicals, and animal carcasses. That summer was unusually hot. The sun baked the river mud, and the smell became so thick, so visceral, that it stopped the gears of the British Empire. In the newly built Houses of Parliament, which sat right on the riverbank, the air was so poisonous that members of Parliament were seen fleeing the building with handkerchiefs soaked in chloride of lime pressed to their faces. They tried to hang curtains soaked in disinfectant over the windows to block the stench, but it was useless. The Mother of Parliaments was being choked by its own waste. To the Victorians, this wasn't just a nuisance, it was a death sentence, because they still believed in the miasma theory, the idea we met after the Black Death. They were convinced that the smell itself was the disease. They thought that if you breathed in the stench of the Thames, your blood would turn to poison and you would drop dead of cholera. But as the politicians were gagging in their silk top hats, a few quiet, obsessive men were looking at the world through a different lens. They were about to prove that the smell was a distraction, and that the real killer was something far more terrifying. A life form that lived in the water, survived on our skin, and thrived in our ignorance. The first crack in the wall of bad air came from a doctor named John Snow. In 1854, 4 years before the Great Stink, a cholera outbreak hit the Soho district of London. In just 10 days, 600 people died. While the rest of the medical world was busy burning incense to purify the air, Snow did something revolutionary. He drew a map. Snow went door to door, marking every death with a black bar. When he finished, the ghost map revealed a chilling pattern. The deaths weren't scattered randomly by the wind. They were clustered tightly around a single water pump on Broad Street. Snow realized that the people dying weren't breathing the same air. They were drinking the same water. He famously convinced the local council to remove the handle of the pump, and the outbreak stopped almost instantly. Snow had proven that the enemy was waterborne. But he still didn't know what the enemy was. To find the what, we have to cross the channel to a laboratory in France, where a chemist named Louis Pasteur was looking at spoiled wine. Pasteur discovered that liquids didn't just turn bad on their own, they were invaded. He saw through his microscope that tiny living organisms, which he called germs, were responsible for fermentation and decay. And then he made the leap that changed history. If germs could turn wine into vinegar, could they turn a healthy person into a corpse? This was the birth of germ theory. It was the most important moment in the history of the human body. Suddenly, the age of the crust wasn't just old-fashioned, it was a biological suicide pact. If the world was crawling with invisible, predatory life forms that could be killed with heat and chemicals, then the act of cleaning was no longer about status or fashion. It was a war. But the public didn't buy it at first. The idea that invisible little bugs could kill a grown man sounded like a fairy tale. It took the work of a British surgeon named Joseph Lister to prove it on the most brutal stage imaginable, the operating table. In the 1860s, a hospital was a place of horror. Surgeons wore the same blood-stained aprons for years as a badge of experience. They didn't wash their instruments, they just wiped them on their pants. The smell of the hospital, that sickly sweet scent of rotting flesh, was so famous that people believed it was safer to have surgery in a stable than in a ward. Half of all patients who survived surgery died days later from hospital gangrene. Lister, inspired by Pasteur, began to experiment. He started washing his hands and his instruments in carbolic acid. He even built a machine that sprayed a fine mist of disinfectant into the air during surgery. The result was a miracle. His patients stopped rotting. The invisible bugs were being held at bay. The sanitary movement was born, and it would reshape the very fabric of our cities. In London, the Great Stink had finally forced the government to act. They hired a brilliant engineer named Joseph Bazalgette to build a sewer system. This was the 19th century equivalent of the moon landing. Bazalgette built 82 miles of massive brick-lined main sewers and 1,100 miles of street sewers. It was a hidden city beneath the city. He used 318 million bricks and moved 670,000 cubic meters of earth. Bazalgette's sewers did something that no doctor could do. They physically separated the human body from its own waste. They took the Great Stink and pumped it out to the sea. And almost instantly, cholera vanished from London. But the real revolution was happening inside the home. This was the moment the bathroom was born. Before 1870, even in wealthy homes, the bathroom wasn't a room. It was a collection of objects moved around by servants. You had a tin tub that was brought into the bedroom or the kitchen. You had a pitcher and a basin on a washstand. You had a clothes stool or a chamber pot hidden in a cupboard. The invention of the S-trap by Alexander Cummings and the refinement of the flush toilet by men like Thomas Crapper, yes, the name is real, though he didn't invent the toilet, he just marketed it brilliantly, changed everything. Water was no longer a medicine you went to a spa to receive. Water was now piped in. This created a massive new demand for a product that had been a luxury for centuries: soap. The late 19th century was the golden age of soap, and it was driven by the first great masters of global marketing. In England, a man named William Hesketh Lever, founder of the Lever Brothers, realized that to sell soap to the masses, he had to sell more than just a cleaning product. He had to sell a lifestyle. Lever created Sunlight soap. He wrapped it in beautiful, brightly colored packaging. He bought massive billboards. He even bought famous paintings and added a bar of soap into the scene to show that cleanliness was art. Lever's genius was to tie soap to patriotism and civilization. One of the most famous advertisements of the era showed a white-clad sailor standing on a deck with the slogan, "The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness." Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth. Cleanliness was no longer just a medical necessity, it was the identity of the British Empire. To be clean was to be Western. To be clean was to be advanced. But as soap became a mass-market commodity, it started to change our biology. In the 1890s, the sanitary obsession reached a fever pitch. We weren't just washing away visible dirt anymore, we were hunting the germ. This is where the modern bathroom finally took its shape. The Victorian bathroom had been a place of heavy wood, carpets, and floral wallpaper. It looked like a living room with a tub. But the germ theory changed the aesthetics of hygiene. Doctors began to warn that wood and fabric trapped microbes. The bathroom became clinical. It was stripped of its decorations and covered in white ceramic tile, porcelain, and chrome. It was designed to look like a laboratory. The white tile was a signal. It showed every speck of dirt so that the dirt could be destroyed. The modern bathroom was built as a sanctuary of sterility. By 1900, the age of the crust was dead and buried. The great forgetting of the Roman baths had been replaced by a great scrubbing. The average middle-class person was now washing their hands several times a day and taking a full-body bath once a week. It was a victory for human health. Life expectancy began to soar as infectious diseases plummeted. But we were about to go too far. In our rush to kill the germ, we were about to start fearing the very air we breathed. We were about to enter the 20th century, where the soap barons would realize that they could make more money by making us self-conscious than by making us healthy. They were about to invent a new kind of stink, not the great stink of the Thames, but the social stink of the individual. They were about to convince us that the natural smell of a human body, the smell that had existed for 200,000 years, was a biohazard and a social death. The war on dirt was over. The war on the body was about to begin. Imagine you are standing in a drugstore in the year 1920. You have lived through the sanitary revolution of the previous block. You know about germs. You trust your doctor. You have a white-tiled bathroom in your home. You are, by any historical standard, the cleanest human being to ever walk the earth. Your risk of dying from cholera or typhoid is practically zero. But as you stand there, looking at the shelves, you are feeling a new kind of terror. It isn't the fear of the Black Death or the great stink of the Thames. It is a quiet, shivering, intimate fear. The fear that your friends are whispering about you behind your back. The fear that you will never get married. The fear that you will lose your job. And all because of a medical condition you didn't even know you had until 5 minutes ago when you saw a magazine advertisement. Welcome to the 20th century, the era when the soap barons realized that health had a ceiling, but shame was infinite. By the turn of the century, the battle against infectious disease was largely won in the West. People were buying soap. They were washing their hands. The problem for the massive chemical corporations, the ancestors of Unilever and Procter & Gamble, was that soap was too good. A single bar lasted a long time, and once you were clean enough to not die of a fever, why would you buy more? To keep the factories humming, they had to move the hygiene goalposts. They had to convince humanity that being clinically clean was not the same as being socially acceptable. They had to invent a new kind of dirt, the invisible stink. The greatest mastermind of this psychological warfare was a man named Gerard Lambert. His father had invented a powerful surgical antiseptic called Listerine, named after Joseph Lister, the hero of Block 4. For decades, Listerine was a boring industrial product. It was used to scrub hospital floors and treat sweaty feet. It was a chemical tool, not a beauty product. But in the 1920s, Gerard Lambert found a forgotten medical term in an old textbook, halitosis. At the time, bad breath was just a fact of life, like having a nose or ears. It wasn't a condition. Lambert launched a massive advertising campaign that treated halitosis as if it were a deadly plague. The ads didn't talk about germs, they talked about social failure. One of the most famous ads showed a beautiful, weeping woman with the headline, "Often a bridesmaid, never a bride." The text explained that she was perfect in every way, but she had one hidden flaw that drove men away. She had halitosis. It worked. In just a few years, Listerine's sales jumped from $100,000 a year to over $4 million. Lambert hadn't cured a disease, he had medicalized a social insecurity. He had taught us to fear the very air coming out of our mouths. But the mouth was just the beginning. The next frontier was the armpit. For 200,000 years of human history, the smell of sweat was simply the smell of a human. In the 17th century, we hid it with musk. In the 18th century, we absorbed it with linen. But in the early 20th century, a new product appeared, Eau Ro No. It was the first effective deodorant, a mixture of aluminum salts that physically plugged the sweat glands. At first, nobody wanted it. People thought it was unhealthy to stop the body from sweating, and many thought it was vulgar to even talk about armpits. So, the marketers turned to shame therapy. In 1919, an ad appeared in Ladies' Home Journal that sent shockwaves through America. It was titled, "Within the Curve of a Woman's Arm." It suggested that a woman could be beautiful and charming, but if she had underarm odor, she was secretly revolting to her husband. The ad was so aggressive that many women canceled their subscriptions in protest. But the sales of Odo Rono tripled. The industry had discovered a golden rule. To sell a product, you first have to sell a defect. This was the birth of the self-conscious body. We were taught that our natural state, unscented, unsterilized, and unpolished, was a biohazard to our social lives. This gave rise to the gospel of the daily shower. Think about the physical logic of a shower versus a bath. A bath is a ritual of immersion. It takes time, it is social, it is Roman. A shower is a machine. It is fast, it is vertical, and it is industrial. As the 20th century accelerated, especially in post-war America, the daily shower became the mandatory morning maintenance for the modern worker. The bathroom was no longer a place to get clean after a week of work. It was a place to reset the clock of shame. Every 24 hours, the bio-armor of deodorant, toothpaste, and soap expired, and you had to step back into the porcelain temple to become human again. This era also gave us the soap opera. It sounds like a joke, but the term is literal. In the 1930s, soap companies like Procter & Gamble realized that their primary customers were housewives. To keep them thinking about cleanliness all day long, they began to sponsor daytime radio dramas and later television shows. These shows were designed to create an emotional connection between the drama of life and the drama of laundry. Between the scenes of betrayal and romance, the commercials would tell you that your family's happiness depended on the whiteness of your sheets and the freshness of your collars. Hygiene had become a moral duty of the housewife. If her husband's shirt was gray or her children's hands were dirty, it was seen as a sign of a broken home. We were back to the holy squalor of the Middle Ages, but in reverse. Now, cleanliness was the only path to salvation. By the 1950s, the sanitary temple was complete. The American bathroom became a technicolor marvel of pink and mint green tile. We were dousing ourselves in more chemicals than any generation in history. We had shampoo for the hair, conditioner for the follicles, deodorant for the pits, mouthwash for the breath, and astringent for the face. We were obsessed. But in our rush to become scentless and sterile, we had forgotten something fundamental. We had forgotten that our bodies were not machines. They were ecosystems. For thousands of years, we had lived in a symbiotic relationship with the dirt. Our immune systems had been trained by the bacteria of the earth. But in the mid-20th century, we had created a world so clean, so scrubbed, and so bleached that our own bodies were starting to get confused. We were about to hit the hygiene paradox. As we moved into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, we began to notice something strange. Infectious diseases like cholera were gone, but new modern plagues were rising. Asthma, allergies, eczema, and autoimmune disorders. It turned out that by killing every germ, we had left our immune systems with nothing to do, and they were starting to attack the body itself. We had spent 2,000 years trying to get into the tub. We had fought the church. We had fought the doctors of the Black Death. We had built massive sewers, and we had spent billions on advertising to convince ourselves that we were dirty. And now, as the 21st century dawned, a new generation of scientists was starting to say something that would have horrified the Sun King and confused the Romans. Maybe you should stop washing so much. Humanity was about to make a full circle. We were about to rediscover the microbiome. We were about to realize that some of those invisible bugs weren't our enemies, they were our best friends. The age of the scrub was about to meet the age of the probiotic. But before we could return to the earth, we had to survive the final, most extreme version of the cleanliness cult. The version where we started to treat our entire planet as a quote-unquote germ that needed to be paved over. The story of the soap bar was about to become the story of the quote, sterile world. And the final chapter would be the most surprising of all, because it would lead us right back to that one-room, smoky hut in the north of England, wondering if we had made the right bargain after all. Look at your hands, right now. Stop reading for a second and just look at the palms, the creases of your knuckles, the beds of your fingernails. To your eyes, they might look perfectly clean. You might have washed them 5 minutes ago with an antibacterial gel that promised to kill 99.9% of all known germs. But you are looking at an illusion. In the time it took you to read that sentence, millions of living creatures are moving across the landscape of your skin. They are feeding on your oils. They are fighting for territory. They are communicating with your immune system, and they are dying. You are not an individual. You are a planet. You are a walking, breathing ecosystem. And the most shocking discovery of the 21st century, the discovery that is currently dismantling the 2,000-year history of hygiene we have just tracked, is that without these germs, you wouldn't just be dirty, you would be dead. We have spent the last 5 blocks watching humanity run away from the stink. We saw the Romans try to drown it in marble spas. We saw the Middle Ages try to seal it out with a crust of grime. We saw the Sun King hide it with perfume and the Victorians attack it with carbolic acid. We saw the advertising moguls of the 20th century turn it into a weapon of social shame. For 2 millennia, we have viewed dirt as the enemy. But as we stand in the 3rd decade of the 21st century, we are realizing that we might have won the war on dirt so completely that we have accidentally declared war on ourselves. This is the hygiene hypothesis. It is a biological paradox that began to emerge in the late 1980s when epidemiologists noticed something strange. In countries that were too clean, where children grew up in sterile apartments, played on bleached floors, and were doused in hand sanitizer, the rates of asthma, hay fever, and food allergies were skyrocketing. But in dirty environments, on traditional farms, in homes with pets, or in developing nations where water wasn't yet sterilized, these conditions were almost non-existent. The science behind it is as elegant as it is terrifying. Your immune system is like an elite army. For 200,000 years, that army was trained in the trenches of the natural world. It spent every day fighting off parasites, bacteria, and viruses. But in our modern, white-tiled sanctuaries of sterility, that army has nothing to do. It is bored. And like any bored army, it starts to get twitchy. It starts looking for enemies where none exist. It starts attacking pollen. It starts attacking peanuts. Eventually, it starts attacking the body itself. We have bleached away the very dirt that used to be our teacher. This realization has given birth to a radical new movement in hygiene, the No Soap Rebellion. Across the world, a new generation of scientists and biohackers are doing something that would make a Victorian doctor faint. They are intentionally adding bacteria back to their skin. They are throwing away their shampoo. They are stopping their daily showers. One of the most famous figures in this movement is a chemical engineer named David Whitlock. He hasn't taken a shower in over 15 years. He doesn't smell like a rotting corpse, and he isn't covered in sores. Instead, he sprays his body with a mist of ammonia-oxidizing bacteria, the same kind of good germs that live in the dirt. He argues that by using harsh soaps and hot water every day, we are destroying our acid mantle, the natural protective layer of oils and bacteria that keep our skin healthy. We are like gardeners who keep using bleach on their soil and then wonder why the flowers won't grow. We are scrubbing away the good guys to kill a few bad guys that might not even be there. This is the microbiome revolution. We are finally beginning to understand that we are more bug than human. By cell count, you are actually 50% to 90% microbial. You are a host for a trillion-member orchestra of bacteria, fungi, and viruses that help you digest food, regulate your mood, and, ironically, protect your skin from the actual bad germs. And yet, just as we were starting to make peace with the dirt, the world changed again. In 2020, the Great Forgetting was interrupted by a Great Terror. The COVID-19 pandemic did something that hadn't happened since the 14th century. It made water and soap the primary tools of survival once again. Overnight, the sanitary movement of the 19th century was reborn. We were told to sing Happy Birthday twice while scrubbing our hands. We were told to wipe down our groceries with bleach. We were told to view every human touch as a potential biohazard. For a brief moment, the 21st century looked exactly like 1347. We were back to the fear of the invisible killer. We were back to the miasma theory, though this time we called it aerosol transmission. We retreated into our sterile boxes and bleached our worlds until our skin was raw. But as the pandemic subsided, it left us with a deep philosophical question. What kind of world have we built? We have built a world where we are cleaner than any human being in history, but we are also lonelier. We have traded the wet, public, communal life of the Roman bath for the dry, private, clinical life of the smartphone and the individual shower. We have traded the smell of a human being, the scent that triggered ancient evolutionary responses of attraction, bonding, and trust, for the smell of cool morning rain or citrus blast produced in a chemical factory in New Jersey. Think about the staggering inequality of light we saw in the video on Windows. There is now an inequality of clean. The wealthy live in air-purified, climate-controlled, ultra-sanitized environments. The poor still live in the great stink of industrial pollution and neglected infrastructure. We are using hygiene to segregate ourselves more effectively than any wall or fence. We have come a long way from the one-room, smoky hut in the north of England. We have escaped the plague. We have escaped the cholera. We have escaped the holy squalor of the monks. But in doing so, we have created a chemical cocoon. We spend 90% of our lives indoors. We walk on synthetic carpets. We breathe filtered air. We eat sterilized food. We wash ourselves with surfactants that strip away our biological identity. We have won the war on the earth, but the earth is where we came from. So what is the answer? Is it the dry rub of Louis XIV? Is it the cold plunge of Beau Brummel? Is it the clinical tile of the Victorians? Perhaps the answer lies in a new kind of bathing. Not the washing of the skin, but the washing of the soul. The Japanese have a concept called Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing. It isn't about soap or water. It is about submerging yourself in the dirt of the forest. It is about breathing in the phytoncides, the natural chemicals released by trees that boost your immune system. It is about reconnecting with the good bacteria of the world. It is a return to the holy squalor, but with the benefit of modern science. The story of hygiene is the story of the human ego. It is the story of our attempt to separate ourselves from the animals, from the mud, and from our own mortality. We use soap because we are afraid of rot. We use perfume because we are afraid of decay. We use bleach because we are afraid of the invisible. But the rot, the decay, and the invisible are what make life possible. The next time you step into the shower, take a second to look at that bar of soap. Remember the 2,000 years of shivering, scheming, and praying that went into that little block of chemicals. Remember the Roman slaves tending the furnaces. Remember the plague doctors with their bird masks. Remember the Sun King changing his shirt. Remember the mothers in the London slums who fought for a single bucket of water. You are the beneficiary of a long, damp, and often ridiculous war. You have the luxury of being clean without even trying. But as you scrub away the day, ask yourself, what else are you washing away? Are you washing away your connection to the earth? Are you washing away the tiny allies that keep you healthy? Are you washing away the scent of being human? We began this story with a hole in the wall and a gamble with the cold. Мы закончили его в стерильной белой комнате, сражаясь с собственным иммунитетом. Мы прошли путь от божественной грязи до убийственной чистоты. И, возможно, самое большое достижение, которое нас ждет в будущем, это не изобретение нового, еще более мощного мыла, а смелость снова позволить себе быть немного земными. The wheel of hygiene keeps turning. From the wet to the dry, from the public to the private, from the sacred to the clinical. We are still searching for that perfect temperature, that perfect scent, and that perfect state of being. We are still humans, trapped in a vessel of flesh, trying to find a way to let the light in without letting the world destroy us. History is a dirty business, but it's the only way we know who we are. If you've made it to the end of this journey, you've seen how a simple bar of soap can hold the entire history of human fear and ambition. It's a story that's still being written, one shower at a time. And if you want to see how another everyday object, something as simple as a chair or a pocket, holds a history just as bizarre as this one, that story is waiting for you. Stay curious, stay observant, and maybe, just for today, don't be afraid to get a little bit dirty.